Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to explore the world of physical education, specifically the theories behind it. I hear you want to understand the educational philosophies shaping PE, like how the curriculum is designed and how it's actually taught in the classroom.
Yeah, that's right. This is such a cool area to explore because all these ideas directly impact how PE can help with, well-being, not just physical skills.
And you've brought some excerpts from a book to help us out. It's called Physical Education and Well-Being by Lynch, published in 2024. So let's just jump right into it.
Okay, first things first. Why does theory even matter in PE? Some people might think it should just be about getting kids active and having fun.
I hear that a lot. It's a pretty common misconception, but
Yeah.
you got to think about it like this. Tracy and Morrow, they did some research back in 2017, and they found something interesting. A teacher's beliefs about education actually influence what they do in the classroom. You know what I mean? So a PE teacher who thinks drills are the best way to learn will teach very differently from a teacher who believes in letting kids learn through play. Well, that makes a lot of sense. It's like, I don't know, using a different blueprint to build a house. You might have all the same materials, but you get a totally different house depending on the plan you follow.
Totally. It's exactly like that. And Ewing, in 2010, built on that idea even more. He said that how we think about learning affects, like, everything. How we plan the curriculum, how we see if kids are actually learning, and even the way we talk about their progress. So theory, it's not just some abstract concept. It has real consequences for what happens in PE classes and how kids experience it.
You're saying that if we understand these theories, we can understand PE and its impact on kids.
For sure. And Lynch argues that we can use these theories to make PE programs even better, programs that really benefit kids. It's about, like, having a purpose in your approach to what happens in the gym or on the field.
I'm starting to see why this is all so important. But before we get too far, can we just define pedagogy? That word keeps popping up, and I want to make sure I really get it. What exactly does that mean?
Well, pedagogy is basically the art and science of teaching. Back in 2006, Kirk and some other researchers defined it as, well, it includes not just teaching itself, but also what the kids are learning and the curriculum we use to guide them.
So it's looking at education as a whole, like all the different parts that create a good learning experience. Kind of like how a chef thinks about the ingredients, how to cook them, and how to make the dish look good.
That's a really good analogy. You got it. Now, you mentioned earlier that you wanted to understand the difference between theories and models, right? People mix those up all the time, and it can be confusing.
Yeah, definitely. It can feel like I'm doing a word puzzle instead of learning about PE.
It happens all the time. Let me try to make it clear. Think of theories as those big picture frameworks that help us understand the world. Remember that blueprint analogy we used earlier? That's a theory. It's based on research and gives us a way to look at education. Models, though, those are like specific instructions for how to use those theories in a real classroom.
So the theory is like the blueprint, and the model is like the step-by-step guide to build a house.
You got it. And Tinning, back in 2010, pointed out that those models are super important because they give teachers, like, a roadmap for how to actually teach. They take those theoretical ideas and turn them into something you can actually do.
Makes sense. The book mentions lots of models that have been popular in PE over the years, things like TGFU, game sense, play practice. It feels like a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, there are a lot. Tinning's research shows how PE has evolved over time, and those different models reflect how our ideas about learning have changed too. We've gone from things like Swedish gymnastics and movement education to newer stuff like TGFU and game sense. Each one has a slightly different way of applying those big educational theories.
It's interesting to see how PE has changed as we've learned more about how kids learn and grow. It's definitely not just about calisthenics and dodgeball anymore.
Yeah.
Speaking of change, let's shift gears a bit. You mentioned psychological perspectives. How do they relate to PE?
It might seem surprising at first, but remember, we're trying to get a complete understanding of well-being in PE, not just physical skills, right?
Yeah.
Well, the way we think about psychology actually influences how we approach education in general, from how teachers teach to the policies that are made for schools.
Interesting. So are you saying that understanding these psychological perspectives can help us understand why different teaching methods exist? Like to understand the why behind the what?
Exactly. And there are a few major perspectives that have been really influential in education. Each one gives us a different lens to look at how kids learn and how we can teach them best.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into these different perspectives. What's first?
Let's start with the biological perspective. This one, as you might guess, looks at how our biology, like our brains and nervous systems, affects how we learn and behave.
So we're talking about how physical activity can actually change the brain and make it ready to learn new things.
That's it. Then there's the behavioral perspective. It got really popular in the early 1900s thanks to psychologists like John B. Watson. This one's all about what we can actually see people doing, their behavior, and how we learn through things like rewards and punishments.
Oh, like Pavlov's dog. So in a PE class, this might be like using positive reinforcement to encourage a kid to learn a new skill, like praising their effort or giving them points for getting better.
Perfect example. Now, in contrast to behaviorism, which focuses on what we can see, there's the cognitive perspective. This one's all about what's happening inside the brain. Those mental processes like memory, problem solving, and making decisions.
So instead of just training the body, we're also thinking about how the student is thinking and making decisions during physical activities.
You got it. Jean Piaget, he's a super famous developmental psychologist, and he's a key figure in this perspective. His work, especially his theory about how kids' thinking changes as they get older, helps us figure out how to adjust our teaching to different age groups.
It makes sense that you wouldn't expect a 6-year-old to understand complex strategies the same way a 12-year-old would. You'd have to change the activities to fit their development level.
Exactly. And in PE Rink, back in 2010, emphasized the importance of understanding something called the information processing model. This model shows us that learning physical skills isn't just about muscle memory. It's about how the brain takes in information from around us and uses it to guide movement.
This is all starting to make sense now.
Hmm.
Are there any other psychological perspectives we need to know about? Or is that it?
We have a couple more. Next is the psychoanalytic perspective. This one digs into the unconscious mind and how our experiences, especially from childhood, can shape our behavior and learning.
Okay, that sounds a bit more complicated. Are we going to start psychoanalyzing students during gym class?
I don't think so. But it's helpful to remember that students bring their whole selves to PE, like their emotional baggage, their past experiences. We have to be sensitive to those individual needs.
So maybe there are reasons why a student might be struggling with a certain skill or activity. We should be understanding about that.
For sure. And finally, we have the phenomenological perspective. Some people call it the humanistic approach. This one's all about subjective experience and how each person tries to reach their full potential. It's about self-actualization, becoming the best version of yourself.
Oh, so we should be helping students take charge of their own learning and well-being.
That's right. It's about creating the right learning environment, one that supports each student's individual needs and goals, seeing their value and potential. In PE, this could mean letting students choose activities, encouraging them to set their own goals, and celebrating their progress in ways that matter to them.
I really like that idea. It's not about everyone doing the same thing. It's about each student having their own experience.
Exactly. Okay, now that we've looked at these 5 psychological perspectives, we can start to see how they influence the main teaching approaches used in PE. Are you ready to see how those theories actually work in the gym?
Absolutely. I'm ready to see how these ideas come to life on the field. Let's do it.
So we've talked about these different psychological lenses, but I'm ready to see how they actually work in a PE class. What are these main educational approaches?
There are 3 main approaches that we can really dive into. There's the behavioral approach, the constructivist approach, and then the critical approach. Each one of these uses those psychological perspectives we talked about in different ways.
Okay, let's start with the behavioral approach. Is it about setting goals and then measuring how well students are doing, like a fitness tracker, but for learning?
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
The behavioral approach really emphasizes structure and getting measurable results. Think about it. You have clear goals, content that's presented in a specific order, and you use positive reinforcement to keep students motivated. It's kind of like taking a big skill and breaking it down into smaller, easier to learn steps. Lynch, she talks about this. She refers to Ornstein and Hunkins, their work back in 2017, and describes it as a very logical and structured way of teaching. So it's like having a checklist of skills to learn, and the teacher uses rewards and encouragement to help students master each skill. Is that it?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Westbrook and his colleagues, they did some research on this back in 2013, and they highlighted how effective this approach can be for teaching very specific skills. Like, think about teaching someone to shoot a basketball. You could break it down into steps: stance, grip, aim, follow through, and then reward them as they get better at each step.
That makes a lot of sense, especially for those basic skills. But I'm curious, does this approach work all the time? It seems like it could get repetitive. Or maybe too rigid for some kids, you know?
You're right. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution. In fact, one of the big criticisms is that it focuses too much on rote learning, like memorizing facts, and maybe not so much on really understanding the concepts. Ewing, back in 2010, he pointed this out. He said that this approach can actually limit creativity and kids being able to make their own choices. He even said that Tyler, way back in 1949, his model for this approach, it was too linear. Like, it felt like a factory line for learning.
Yeah, I get that. It's like the difference between memorizing the rules of a game versus understanding the strategies and what makes it fun to play.
Exactly, you get it. And while it can be good for those basic skills, it doesn't always capture how complex learning really is and all the different ways that kids can learn. Westbrook, he actually uses this analogy about memorizing the names of rivers. Like, it's good for memory, but it's not really learning.
It seems like this behavioral approach misses those spontaneous learning moments that happen when kids are just messing around and trying new things.
That's a really important point. The behavioral approach, with its focus on being efficient and getting those measurable results, sometimes forgets about the importance of exploration and kids discovering things on their own. And remember, we're trying to raise well-rounded kids, not just kids who can perform well on tests.
So it sounds like the behavioral approach has some good things and some bad things. Are there any arguments for still using it,
Yeah.
even with those downsides?
There are, especially when it comes to learning the basics. The Australian government, back in 2014, they did a review of the national curriculum. They actually argued that direct instruction, which is a key part of the behavioral approach, is still the best way to teach certain basic skills. They think that direct instruction is super important, especially before students can move on to more challenging stuff.
So there's still a place for direct instruction, even in a world where we're focusing more and more on students directing their own learnings, like learning the alphabet before you can write a story.
You got it. And even though we don't want kids just memorizing things, having those basic skills can be really empowering too. Westbrook and his colleagues talked about this. They pointed out that the behavioral approach, with its focus on clear goals and seeing progress, can make students feel good about what they're learning.
Okay, that makes sense. It's all about balance, right? But you mentioned some real-world issues with this approach, particularly in the UK. What did Lynch have to say about that?
Yeah. So Lynch, she looked at what's been happening with government policies in England, specifically how they're influenced by Ofsted. That's the Office for Standards in Education.
Ofsted, that's the organization that evaluates how well schools are doing, right? I've heard teachers have mixed feelings about their methods.
That's not surprising. Ofsted has been criticized for, like, putting too much emphasis on standardized testing and using numbers to measure success, which kind of lines up with that behavioral approach. They're all about those measurable outcomes, sometimes even if it means ignoring other important aspects of learning.
It sounds like all that testing puts a ton of pressure on teachers and students.
It really can. And Lynch, she talks about a report by Caulfield from 2017. It raises concerns that Ofsted's methods might be doing more harm than good, like creating a culture where everyone's stressed and anxious about those test scores.
It's like judging a fish on how well it can climb a tree, right? It doesn't give you the whole picture.
Perfect analogy. Lynch points out that this pressure has negative consequences for teachers, too. There are reports showing that they're overworked, burned out, and feeling unappreciated. And when teachers aren't happy, it affects the quality of education for everyone.
It's a chain reaction. And the UK, they haven't done so well in those international PIAS rankings. Maybe that's because they're so focused on standardized testing.
Yeah, you're right. Even though they've tried to improve test scores by using more of that behavioral approach, the UK hasn't seen the results they wanted. The OECD, they put out a report in 2023. It shows that their scores have actually gone down in recent years. It seems like just focusing on those measurable outcomes doesn't automatically make education better.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You need a different approach.
Exactly. And that leads us to our second approach, the constructivist approach.
Okay, I'm ready for a change of pace. What's so different about constructivism?
Well, if the behavioral approach is all about controlling things from the outside and measuring results, constructivism flips that. It's about letting students take charge of their own learning. Think active learning, exploration, and figuring things out through experience.
That sounds so much more interesting and fun.
It can be, and it fits in with this idea of education through movement, which is how Lynch looks at PE and well-being.
Right. It's not just about teaching kids how to move. It's about using movement as a way to learn and grow.
Exactly. Arthur and some other researchers back in 2015, they wrote a book about early childhood education. They described constructivism as recognizing that active learning or play-based learning is super important. It's all about letting kids learn by doing things, by playing, not just by sitting and listening.
It's like giving them the blocks and letting them build whatever they want, instead of giving them a pre-made model to copy.
That's a great analogy. And this approach, it comes from the work of Jean Piaget, who we talked about earlier. He believed that kids learn best by doing things themselves and interacting with their environment.
So you need to create a place where they feel safe to try new things, mess up, and figure things out on their own. It's not about being right all the time. It's about learning from the process.
You got it. And in this approach, the teacher's role changes. They're not just the person who gives out information. They become more like a guide. They help students explore, give them support when they need it, and ask questions that get them thinking more deeply.
It sounds a lot more collaborative, more like a dance and a march.
I like that. And there's this really important concept in constructivism. It's called Vygotsky's zone of proximal development.
Ah, Vygotsky. He was all about how important social interaction is for learning, right?
You're exactly right. This zone of proximal development, it's that sweet spot between what a kid can do by themselves and what they can do with help from someone who knows more. It's like building a scaffold around their learning, giving them just enough support to help them stretch and grow.
So the teacher's like a coach, working with the student, helping them be their best. It's a partnership, not a boss-employee relationship.
That's a perfect way to think about it. And Lynch actually uses the 1999 Queensland HPE syllabus as a really good example of a constructivist curriculum.
What was so special about that syllabus?
Well, it was all about inquiry. Kids were encouraged to ask questions, research problems, and come up with their own conclusions. It focused on those skills you need to be a lifelong learner. Things like critical thinking, problem solving, communication, those are things that go way beyond just PE class.
Sounds like it was ahead of its time, giving kids the power to take charge of their own learning. But I'm wondering, are there any downsides to this approach? Does it have any weaknesses?
One challenge is that it can be tougher to measure progress in the traditional way. When kids have more freedom and control, it's not as simple as just checking things off a list.
That makes sense. It's hard to measure things like understanding or critical thinking.
Yeah.
You can't really capture that on a standardized test.
That's a really good point. And it's something that educators are still trying to figure out. And some people argue that constructivism can be a little too open-ended. If there isn't enough structure or guidance, kids might feel lost or unsure of how to move forward. You need a skilled teacher who knows how to balance giving freedom with giving support.
So it's not about letting kids do whatever they want. It's about giving them a framework to explore within, giving them the tools and guidance they need to build their own understanding.
That's it. And it shows how important that relationship between the teacher and the student is. It's about trust, working together, and both being committed to growing.
Okay, so we've talked about the behavioral approach, which is about structure and measuring outcomes. And we've talked about the constructivist approach, which is about exploration and student-led learning. That leaves us with one more. The critical approach, and honestly, this one sounds a little more intense.
It can be. But it's also really important, especially these days. See, the other two approaches are all about individual learning. But the critical approach, it takes a step back. It looks at how social and political forces influence education and how those forces affect students' lives.
So it's not just about learning to play the game. It's about understanding the world that game exists in, recognizing how things like power dynamics, inequality, and social norms affect our experiences.
You're on the right track. The critical approach is all about encouraging students to think critically about these issues, to question assumptions, and to challenge injustice.
That's powerful. It's like using PE as a platform for social awareness and change. Where did this approach come from?
It comes from the work of Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian educator and philosopher who believed that education could be used to transform society. His idea of critical pedagogy is all about empowering people, especially those who have been marginalized, to challenge the way things are and work towards a more just world.
So it's not just about individual success. It's about working together and speaking up for a better future.
Exactly. Westbrook and his colleagues in their 2013 work, they described Freire's critical pedagogy as having the goal of creating a more humane and just society. They said it's important to listen to the voices of those who have been silenced and to dismantle systems of oppression.
That's a powerful vision. But how does this actually work in a PE setting? We're not staging protests on the basketball court, are we?
Not necessarily. But it does mean going beyond just teaching physical skills and talking about bigger issues like social justice, equity, and inclusion. You might encourage students to think about gender roles in sports, or how lack of resources can limit opportunities for some groups.
So a critical approach in PE could mean having conversations about body image, challenging those gender stereotypes we see in sports, and making sure everyone has a chance to participate.
Exactly. It's about raising awareness, encouraging empathy, and giving students the tools to make a difference. It's about understanding that PE can reflect what's happening in society and can even challenge those systems of power and privilege.
I can see how this approach can have a big impact, both for individual students and for creating a more just and fair society.
Mm,
It's using PE to not just build physical skills, but to build character, compassion, and the ability to think critically.
you got it. Lynch, she points out that critical approaches are now influencing how curricula are being developed in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. It's not just a fringe idea anymore, it's becoming more mainstream.
That's good to hear. It seems like we're moving towards a more well-rounded and socially conscious approach to PE, recognizing that it can impact not just individuals, but whole communities.
That's a great observation. So we've explored these three different educational approaches. Each one has its pros and cons. But in real life, do teachers usually just pick one? It seems like things might be a bit more flexible than that.
That's what I was thinking. My guess is that the really good teachers use parts of all three approaches, depending on the students and the lesson.
You're absolutely right. Ornstein and Hunkins, in their 2017 book, they stress that there isn't one right approach. It's all about understanding how each approach works and being adaptable.
So a really good PE teacher might use direct instruction from the behavioral approach to teach a new skill. And then they might switch to a more constructivist approach, letting the students explore that skill through games and activities. And all along the way, they might sprinkle in some of that critical approach, getting kids to think about the social and ethical side of what they're learning.
That's a great example of how those approaches can all work together to create a really rich and meaningful learning experience.
It's about being adaptable and using different tools to create the best learning environment for your students.
Exactly. And Lynch, back in 2014, she did an analysis of curriculum changes in Australia, and she highlighted how important this blended approach is. It's about recognizing that all students are different and that there's no one-size-fits-all in education.
It seems like the Australian curriculum is moving towards a more constructivist, inquiry-based approach, though, right? Are they moving away from that purely behavioral model?
Yeah, they are. The Australian government, in their 2014 review, they said how important inquiry-based learning is, especially in areas like health and physical education. It shows that we need to move beyond just memorizing facts and teach those higher-order thinking skills that are so important in today's world.
Skills like critical thinking, problem-solving, creativity, and being able to work with others. It's about preparing kids to live in a world that's always changing and needs them to think in new ways.
You got it. It seems like you're really starting to see how these different educational approaches can actually work in real life. But I'm curious, how do they connect with your own experiences in PE?
That's a great question. I think it's time we shifted gears and talked about me and my experiences.
I'm with you. Let's talk about those dodgeball days you mentioned.
When I think about my own PE classes, I can see bits and pieces of those different approaches. Like, I remember some classes that were super structured. Lots of drills, making sure we had the technique down perfectly. It wasn't always terrible, but sometimes it felt like we were on an assembly line, just going through the motions, especially when it was all about how well we performed.
Sounds like the behavioral approach. All about breaking down skills and measuring how well you're doing. It can be good for some things, but yeah, it doesn't always make you feel excited about learning.
Exactly.
Mm.
But I remember feeling way more motivated in classes where the teachers used that constructivist approach.
Mm-hmm.
The ones where we could experiment, play games, and just figure stuff out on our own. It was more like playing than being tested.
It's amazing how a different teaching style can make such a big difference, right? Those constructivist environments can help kids get creative, solve problems, and actually enjoy moving their bodies.
Totally. And, thinking back, I can even remember some teachers using that critical approach. A few went beyond the usual sports stuff to talk about things like body image, gender stereotypes in sports, and
Yeah.
being a good sport. Those conversations really stuck with me.
It's crazy how a small thing like that can change how you see the world. It shows how PE can be about so much more than just physical stuff. It can be about talking about important social and ethical things, too.
Those were the teachers who got it. They understood that PE is kind of like a mini version of society, a place where we can challenge how things are, make it more inclusive, and show students how to make things better.
Exactly. It all comes back to what we've been talking about with these different approaches. They're not just ideas in a book. They actually affect how we experience PE and how it shapes us as people and as communities.
This deep dive has been eye-opening. I feel like I understand so much more about PE now and how it can benefit people on so many levels.
That's fantastic. And remember, this conversation keeps going. The more we understand these different approaches, the more we can look at our own experiences and advocate for the kind of PE we believe in.
So it's not just about knowing these approaches, it's about using what we know to make things better, whether we're teachers, parents, or just people who value movement and well-being.
I couldn't agree more. We can all be advocates for a more inclusive, empowering, and meaningful approach to PE.
And hey, maybe this deep dive will inspire some of our listeners to think about their own experiences in PE. They might discover something new about how they got to where they are with movement, sport, and well-being. That's something to think about.
I hope so. We've just scratched the surface here, but this has hopefully made you curious and given you some new ways to think about all the different aspects of PE.
And with that, a big thank you to you for joining us on this journey through the world of educational approaches in PE. Until next time, keep moving those minds and bodies.